Directions 24 DIR 74, VCR 1231 74, take one.
North Vietnam, November 1974. The cameraman who filmed these scenes is a member of a United States Church delegation, Protestant and Catholic, that visited North Vietnam to explore two vital areas of concern, reconciliation and reconstruction. To what degree do the North Vietnamese people desire reconciliation with the United States? Should United States churches support reconstruction of war damage in North Vietnam? The delegation was concerned about religious freedom, so they visited many churches, an ancient Roman Catholic cathedral, where services continue in bomb-damaged buildings that are being repaired today without outside help. They also visited a Protestant church, where the clergy and faithful came out to welcome the visitors. And they saw a hospital, also damaged by bombs, now being rebuilt through Protestant church aid from the United States. But perhaps the most important part of the visit involved talking with the people of North Vietnam. How they feel about themselves and us is the subject of our program today. 3 of the 5 churchmen who made that trip to North Vietnam are with us in our studio as Directions presents Peace Plus 2, North Vietnam Revisited. Good day from New York. I'm Frank Reynolds. And as I said, 3 of the 5 churchmen who made the trip to North Vietnam are with us today. We're going to talk about their visit to that country. I'd like to introduce the Roman Catholic Bishop of Gary, Indiana, Andrew G. Grutka, who has been on this program before, and we're delighted to have you back, Bishop Grutka. Yeah. Bishop Paul A. Washburn of the United Methodist Church. Bishop Washburn makes his home in Chicago. And Don Luce, Executive Director of Clergy and Laity Concerned. Mr. Luce, though quite young, has spent 16 years in Vietnam, which I suppose makes him about as knowledgeable a man about that country as any American possibly could be. Well, gentlemen, as you know, we are about to observe the 2nd anniversary of the signing of the agreement that was supposed to bring peace to Vietnam. I suppose you found peace of a sort in North Vietnam, although it is still elusive in South Vietnam. Tell me, how did this trip come about? How did it happen? Don?
Well, it came about as a result of an invitation from the Committee of Solidarity with the American People in North Vietnam. They sent a letter to the United States inviting representatives of some of the mainline churches to come to Vietnam. And I think the important thing about the invitation was that instead of naming individuals, they asked that 5 church people come, that these people be selected by the churches themselves. I think it's perhaps the first time that a country which is at war has said to one of the adversary countries to send church leaders, whomever you want, to come and to look without any preconditions. As a matter of fact, when we came, it wasn't until 3 days before we left this country that they had received all of the names of the group that was coming.
So they really did not know who was coming then very far in advance.
That's right. That's right.
Bishop Washburn, was this your first visit to North Vietnam?
It was indeed.
What was your dominant impression?
One of the impressions that stands tall in my mind comes out of the conversation with the Prime Minister. When we were talking about the Paris peace agreement, he said that he thought it was a matter of conscience on the part of participating countries in that agreement, that he thought this was a spiritual problem because we had not had an adequate conscience to support our faithfulness to that agreement. That was one of the high points in the experience, and he spoke as a very quiet, self-assured human being who cared about his people.
Well, did you get the impression that he was telling you in a very polite way that your country is not living up to the agreement?
Yes.
You did?
Yes, and of course we asked in our own minds whether or not their country was living up to the agreement, because we are still at war, but his message was very clear, that the keeping of covenants is a matter of conscience, and only on that basis can we ever hope to keep them.
And they insist, of course, that they are keeping their part of the agreement? Or do they?
He didn't say that.
Did you get an opportunity to question him about that? I'm not particularly interested in the political ramifications.
No, we didn't push him on that, but we heard his message.
Yes. Well, what about the question of religious freedom? I assume you were vitally concerned about that. Did you see people practicing their faith and religion without any restrictions, Bishop Grutka?
Very much so. It's hard to say how free it was, but the churches were filled, particularly the cathedral in Hanoi, with masses beginning at 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, and filled to capacity. In another town, Haiphong, we also visited a church, and this was a very typical church, in that it was a parochial setup with a lot of country people involved. And there I offered to say Mass. And when I politely asked if it would be 7 o'clock or 7:30, I could just see the fright in the pastor's eyes. He says, "I'll be up at 3:30. My people will be up at 4:30. We will begin Mass at 5 o'clock. I said, "We will begin Mass at 5 o'clock." And we were all promptly there at 5 o'clock with a procession, mind you, at that hour, and a band in the darkness to meet us.
Well, Don, you've been there before. Was that unusual?
Life begins really early in Vietnam. I mean, you get up at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, and especially at the time we were there, this is rice harvest time in North Vietnam, and they have the best harvest I think they've ever had, perhaps 25 to 50% greater than last year. It's fortunate. It's one of the few countries in the world that is getting a bumper crop of rice this year. It's due to good weather, to following some new agricultural practices, some better varieties. It's a lot easier to grow rice when you're not being bombed.
Yes.
No, that was
But the leaders and the people are very proud of the fact that they have not been able not only to maintain their production, but to increase it even during the bombing. This is one of their great prides at this time.
You know, we mentioned at the very beginning of this program that we were interested in the question of whether they desire reconciliation with the United States. I don't know whether reconciliation is the proper term, really, but do they really desire better relations, let's say, with the United States? I'm talking now not necessarily about Pham Van Dong or the governmental structure, but how do the people who have been bombed feel about you Americans who were wandering around among them?
Why don't we begin with this Committee on Solidarity with the American People? That's known as a mass movement, and a mass movement must have a unique and singular purpose. Their unique and singular purpose is to build friendship between the people of North Vietnam and the people of the United States. The members of this committee contribute out of their own income the funds which they use to host persons in the United States. It's a voluntary organization. And we found them quite desirous of creating friendships between their people and our people.
Well, is this an organization that is sponsored by the government? Is it connected with the government of North Vietnam in any way?
They say not. But they seem to have entree to government cars and to government people. But it is a mass movement supported by the members of it.
Well, Don, your experience would indicate, you know, there wouldn't be any mass movement like this if the government were not willing to go along with it.
I think that, the government certainly does support the committee. There's no question about this. I also would say, I think one of the most important things to me was over and over we got an interest on the part of this committee and on the part of the government itself, many other people, a desire to have an exchange of people between Vietnam and the United States. I think it's interesting that North Vietnam has enough confidence, in its own people to invite a religious delegate to come to the North. And very often we wandered around alone. We talked to whomever we wanted to. And I'm concerned that at least at this point, our own government doesn't have enough confidence, let's say in the American public, to extend the same kind of invitation to religious leaders in North Vietnam, or to cultural leaders, to writers, to poets, and so on. And I think it would be really great if, we as Americans here in the United States, in Kansas, in the state of Washington, in Chicago, could meet a group of Vietnamese, North Vietnamese, coming to see the way life is here. I think that kind of exchange is the kind of thing that would really help to bring us closer to peace.
Well, why doesn't your committee do what the committee in North Vietnam did? Invite people on the other side to come?
Well, I think one reason is, for example, when we came back through customs in Seattle, Washington, the two bishops were carrying two little baskets which were made by the villagers in a cooperative in Hai Hung. Now, these two little baskets were confiscated by the customs people in Seattle. Now, if you can't get two tiny baskets through the customs, imagine the difficulty of getting the Archbishop of Hanoi through the customs in Seattle, Washington.
Well, I must say, Mr. Luce, I'm not prepared to accept that. I think it might be a lot easier to get the Archbishop of Hanoi through customs than
a basket.
Than a basket, I guess, yes. Well, now...
It would certainly be a joy to have some of the religious leaders from Vietnam come.
Well, has our government made it its policy to discourage such invitations? I mean, I'd like to see them over here. I think it might be very...
Well, there have been invitations from universities to scholars
Yes.
to come and teach here, which have been refused.
Refused, rejected by our government.
Yes.
I see.
There are, by the way, several what are called third force South Vietnamese, and I'm not speaking now of communists or anything like this, but those people who have not taken either side that have been trying to get into the United States. And time after time, these people have been refused entry into the United States.
Well, let's get back.
The Archbishop of Hanoi, with whom I spoke, was deeply interested in the United States, and he particularly asked about a priest in Indianapolis with whom he was familiar.
Really?
Yes, and he was an elderly man, but with a bright smile on his face. It was difficult to understand his isolation, though, from everything that went on in Hanoi.
His isolation?
Mm-hmm. It appeared to me that he was isolated. It took a long time for us to get to see him. And I made it quite a point that I thought the trip, our whole trip, would have been a failure had we not got to see the bishop.
Well, why did you have any difficulty in getting to see him? You know?
Because of technicalities. Our committee really did not understand the functioning, the protocol in the Catholic Church. They didn't know how to go about it. And they weren't so sure that I was right in insisting as a bishop that I could see another brother bishop. And finally, when we broke through, it was a beautiful thing, really. They were as happy as we were about the breakthrough. And we got to see the Archbishop and two other bishops. We got to see about 10 priests. And in each instance, we had different reactions and an interest, unquestionably, in the United States. The fact that, for example, the auxiliary bishop of Hanoi took the trouble to learn English. His assistant priest, 42 years old, the youngest priest that we met on the whole trip, he took the trouble to learn English. When I asked him where did he learn it, by myself. So there is an indication of an interest in communicating with us. And the reconciliation is definitely in the air.
To get back to your question, Frank, our delegation is interested in pursuing the question with the State Department about allowing a group to come here to see our country. And we think that we owe this to the people in North Vietnam as a courtesy and a way to further reconciliation between the peoples of these two countries.
Well, perhaps you owe it to the people of the United States, too.
Yes, indeed.
Tell me now, after a number of years, a good number of years now, living under a communist society, what would you appraise the state of religion, really, in North Vietnam to be today? Is it pursued actively, or is it on the wane? Is there a governmental policy toward it?
There is an article in the Constitution allowing freedom of religion, and one of the measurements which I would place upon it would be the age span of the people in that cathedral in Hanoi. There were children, youth choirs, middle-aged people, elderly people. Some of the nuns were young women. And I think when you see across the age span like that in a cathedral, that is an indicator that there must be some vitality to that movement.
You don't find that in Eastern Europe, do you? Most of the people in the churches are more old, aren't they?
That's correct. The elderly people.
Yes.
But in Hanoi, there was a cross-section involved. However, that can be understood, too, when you realize that in North Vietnam, about 40% of the population is under 16 years of age. 40% of the population, the total population. So that the future of Hanoi is in that young generation coming up right now. But in respect to the future of the church in the North, there are some problems. For example, in the one province which we visited, there were 63 churches and only 13 priests. And it seems to me that I heard the report that there were no priests ordained since 1958 in Hanoi, since 1958.
But in that province, the governor was quite concerned about that fact.
Very much so. And that was a totally Catholic area, however, if you'll remember, because when we asked about Buddhists and when we asked about Protestants, we got a blank stare. So we finally went back to the question. He says, no, they're all Catholics. And he said on Christmas Day, for example, he says the crowds going to the church are so thick that you have to elbow your way through the crowds to get to the church.
I thought it interesting, though, that a communist governor would know as much as he knew about that church and about their need for leadership, about the people who attend. I felt that that was a strong point in favor of a free church.
Well, the government, is it your impression that the government does not feel obliged to discourage church attendance or to discourage the practice of religion?
I didn't see the government discouraging this at all. I would say that I think the biggest problem which both the governor of the province that we were in and also many of the priests brought up was the lack of priests and the age of priests. Give an example. One priest that we met, he had several thousand parishioners and also several churches. And he was telling us about bicycling as fast as he could from church to church to church every Sunday morning. He was in beautiful shape and 77 years old.
77.
You know, so if you want to, you know, keep in good shape, you know, I would really recommend going to several churches every Sunday morning by bicycle.
And 10,000 parishioners, that particular church.
That's right.
Bishop Grutka, I suppose you were particularly interested in the strength of the Catholic Church in North Vietnam, because that's where most of the Catholics used to be in Vietnam,
correct.
isn't it true?
That's correct.
But they left in 54.
And now it's just reversed. The predominance is in the South. In fact, it's almost exactly the reverse. At one time, there were only 300,000 Catholics in the South, and there were way over 1 million in the North. Now there are roughly about 800,000 to 1 million Catholics in the North, but roughly 1,700,000 in the South. And the same way with the proportion of priests. This is the biggest mystery to me. That loyalty, that uniqueness of the Christian, the Catholic in North Vietnam. I can't imagine this happening in hardly any other country. Couldn't imagine it happening in the United States, where the priests and the bishops tell their people, this area is no longer suitable for the practice of the Catholic faith. So we're all leaving, and we're going south. Come with us. And the people pick up priests by the hundreds, some of the bishops, and they leave everything behind and head for south. And they didn't know where they were going, but they followed. Now that loyalty to their pastors, to their vicars, is an astounding thing which is hard to describe and hard to understand.
And now 20 years later, though, I'm sitting here in New York with 3 American churchmen who tell me that there is religious freedom in North Vietnam, that the practice of religion is not being inhibited or discouraged.
I think, yeah,
I'm not sure I understand.
Going back to the history of this, I think one of the things which happened, which I was very sad to hear about, was a combination of 2 things. One, at one point, the apostolic delegate to Vietnam at the time in 1951 had issued a letter excommunicating people for cooperating with the communists. And the second thing was that a rumor was started saying that the Virgin Mary had gone south statue built with tears going down the eyes of the statue of Mary, Virgin Mary, encouraging people to go south. And this sort of pushed, a lot of people into going south. What has happened now, and what I think we're very joyful to find, is that after that, the priests that remained, and the Catholics that remained, found that contrary to what many people had been told, they were allowed to continue going to their churches. They were allowed, the kind of freedom to, go to church, to say Mass, or go to the Protestant churches and so on.
Church in Vietnam, the Catholic Church, is relatively young. I think the first diocese that was established there was only in 1883, and all the other dioceses followed thereafter.
Was that set up by the French?
By the French at the time. But the Christianity really came by way of Spain and Portugal, early in 1600 sometime. And then, of course, there followed a terrible persecution in which over 130,000 Catholics were put to death, and many hundreds of priests. And the French stepped into the picture about that time. And then the church began to prosper, just as the scriptures indicate that the blood of martyrs becomes the seed of Christians. And that appears to be the case in Vietnam, because both areas are growing. Even the North Catholicity is on the increase, at least by the statistics.
There's another important factor, and that is that the Buddhists, the Roman Catholics, and the Protestants all have seats in the National Assembly. And I think that is not a factor in any other communist country that I know about.
No, I wouldn't think there are many priests in the Supreme Soviet, are there?
No, I wouldn't know of any. But there are actually 4 in Vietnam.
Yes.
And 1 priest is on the national, and 3 others in other positions. We had inquired about that. Very definitely the case.
Well, now, gentlemen, what do you believe you ought to be telling your people here in the United States about North Vietnam? Are you going to ask for funds to help rebuild churches or to help the people of North Vietnam?
We've already been asking for funds in our church through the Fund for Reconstruction and Reconciliation, which is under the guidance of the World Council of Churches, and under a committee on which only one North American person sits. And so that project is underway. In fact, while we were there, on the first Saturday, the first shipment of drugs and medical supplies was delivered to the Haiphong Harbor from that fund.
Do you believe... Go ahead, Bishop.
And I know that Bishop Slostrom, who's the head of the Catholic Relief Services, is ready at any time to go in there and do whatever he can. The Catholic Relief Services at one time were in North Vietnam, and then they were told to leave. But the Catholic Relief Services are ready to go back and do what they can to help the people.
Don, do you believe that the people of North Vietnam are willing to accept aid from the people of the United States?
I think that
the government of the United States?
I think, well, there's 2 questions. One, in terms of the relationships between Vietnamese and Americans. I think that they're very open to have a kind of both a dialogue, and they need help. In the hospital, they need the medicines. The bombing, for example, destroyed much of the housing, and people have been crowded into very, very small areas, many people in a tiny room. And there is a problem of tuberculosis. They need the new vaccines that have been developed, to prevent tuberculosis. They need the malaria pills and so on. In the mountains, where it's very, very cold, there's a need for clothing. So that, they are open to this. On the government side, in Paris, 2 years ago, we signed an agreement which pledged ourselves, our government and our country, to help in the reconstruction of North Vietnam. The problem is, will North Vietnam accept, American governmental aid while the United States is still providing the bombs that are being dropped on villages in the South? And that, I think, is a very difficult question. And when we asked the Prime Minister, about whether they would accept, American government aid, according to Article 21 of the Paris Agreements, his reply was, well, that from their point of view, all of the agreements that were made in Paris had to be kept, not just singling out Article 21, but all of those articles. And I think that they would put the emphasis at this point on saying there has to be peace. With peace, then the reconstruction, the reconciliation can take place.
But we do have evidence, John, that they will accept help from the churches.
Very definitely.
Yes,
From the churches?
Yes.
You were telling me, I believe, Bishop Grutka, about a statue that you saw with a rather depressing inscription. I'm thinking now about their eventual attitude toward the people of the United States in view of the hostilities between us.
Yes, well, that was not far away from Bachmeier, the hospital that was bombed on Christmas Day, and that whole stretch of that one street, about a mile long, roughly, that was totally destroyed. And there, this statue of this lady holding a dead child in her arms, and under her foot she had the helmet of an American Air Force pilot with the inscription on there, eternal hatred to the aggressors, the United States aggressors.
Eternal hatred?
Mm-hmm.
Well, do you think it's going to be eternal? What are the prospects for ameliorating it? No?
I don't think so at all. And I think one of the amazing things to me was the ability of the Vietnamese to distinguish between governmental policy and people. I mean, we walked very often alone, in the streets of Saigon, in the streets of Hanoi, I'm sorry, in the villages, and in the communities. And I mean, like, I was never afraid. There's no reason to be afraid. People are just, the kids come up and talk to you, older people do, in the marketplace, people kid with you. It's very open.
Frank, the people there want the same things we want. They want food, they want clothing, they want decent housing, they want cultural experience, and we had fine experiences with the culture of North Vietnam. They want faith, they want their fatherland to be respected. These are all of the things that we want in our country. And I think when we meet each other as human beings, at the level of the things we really want, we can understand that perhaps the life of the people is far more important than the life of the governments, although we can't do away with governments. But the life of the people is the common bond. We were just almost inundated in some of these public squares by children and young people and adults. There was no, if it's eternal hatred, it's not total hatred, because the people exhibited much love and kindness toward us, place after place.
There's one thing, however, and I brought this out to the
Yes.
Prime Minister, the element of fear. There is a fear of communism and its desire to gain the total possession of a man, body, mind, and soul. And I noticed he reacted quite vehemently to that. That he was in agreement that fear somehow or other has to be done away with. And the only way you're going to do away with fear is to get down to the truth and open up lines of communication. Because we found everywhere we went a contradiction in statistics. We heard anywhere from 200,000 to 1,200,000 refugees left. So we had so many different stories about the MIAs. That was on the minds of so many of our people. We heard figures from 1,000 to 300. The latest figure that we heard right from one of the members of the committee was that the list is now under 300.
Gentlemen, I assume we are just about out of time. I assume that you all believe your trip was worthwhile, a useful exercise. Like to go back?
I
Next
would,
year.
but I would like to say to our people, too, that I come back feeling that war is unhealthy for all of us. We ought to do away with it.
For all living creatures. Yeah. Thank you very much. Dr. Luce, Bishop Washburn, Bishop Grutka, we're grateful to you all for being with us today.